Africa speaks back. The voice, the truth, the continent on its own terms.
Africa has spoken. Now pass it on. Subscribe, like, share.
They weren't breaking out, they were breaking ground. In the summer of 2025, over 2,000 inmates in Burkina Faso walked out of their cells, not to escape, protest, or demand mercy, but to clean the streets, to plant trees, to rebuild their country. It wasn't a protest, it wasn't a pardon, it was policy, and it came from the top, from a man leading one of the most disruptive justice reforms on African soil today, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Here's the twist. These prisoners weren't seen as threats. They were recast as builders. Their sentence wasn't erased, it was reimagined. And in doing so, Burkina Faso may have just flipped the entire philosophy of incarceration. But that raises the question, what if prison wasn't designed to isolate? What if it was meant to reintegrate? And what if the West got it all wrong? In this story, we follow a government that's not asking for aid or applause. It's asking one thing. What does justice look like when it's built for your people, not for your colonizers? Today, we take you inside a decision that's sending ripples across Africa, raising eyebrows in the West, and forcing all of us to reconsider what a prison is actually for. So stay with us, because this isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about the future of justice itself, and that future starts here. Let's begin with the moment it all became real. A single document, a government seal, and a decree that redefined the meaning of punishment in one of Africa's most resilient nations. It didn't look like justice, it looked like construction. On the morning of July 30th, 2025, a government seal hit paper, and just like that, everything changed. Burkina Faso's Ministry of Justice announced a sweeping directive. Over 2,000 inmates would be temporarily released, not pardoned, not set free without consequence, reassigned. Across 22 municipalities, prisoners were moved out of overcrowded cells and into the streets, not to disappear, but to build. Their sentences were converted into labor contracts, their identities reframed, not convicts, but contributors. The program's official name was the Labor Intensive Work Support Initiative, but what it really was felt closer to a national reboot. Between August and December, these former inmates were tasked with cleaning over 100 kilometers of city gutters, removing more than 1,000 metric tons of trash, clearing 500 hectares of overgrown public land, and planting 15,000 trees. The scope was massive, the symbolism even bigger. This wasn't a feel-good reintegration campaign, it was a redefinition of justice. Punishment wasn't erased, it was redirected. And suddenly, a prison sentence wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new role. We often ask, can people change? This program flipped the question around, what if we changed what we expected from them? Most of the inmates involved were nonviolent. Some had been convicted of petty theft, traffic incidents, or civic violations. Some hadn't even seen a courtroom, just held in cells for months waiting. Now they were given gloves, shovels, and seedlings. One of them, Madu, age 30, now working near Ouagadougou, said, "Last week I wore shackles. This week I'm holding a rake." That kind of statement says more than any press release. It speaks to something many systems forget. People who failed can still build. And maybe, just maybe, they're the ones who most need the chance to. From our point of view, there's something undeniably human about this policy. It doesn't excuse crime, but it recognizes the difference between punishment and waste. If someone's debt to society is going to be paid, why not let them pay it forward? Of course, it's not without risk. Critics have raised real questions about supervision, safety, and public perception. Would you feel comfortable knowing someone who once broke the law is now fixing your street? But if we're being honest, the alternative, warehousing people in silence and isolation, isn't working either, especially when those people return with no skills, no income, and no sense of value. What if correction didn't have to mean confinement? What if dignity, not fear, created stronger communities? Burkina Faso is testing that hypothesis. And for many, this isn't just justice reform, it's a cultural shift. If this idea resonates with you, if you believe that building a nation can start with rebuilding people, tap the like so we know you're here. Hit subscribe if you want to follow the stories that challenge the system, not just report on it. Because what happened in Burkina Faso wasn't an accident. It was a decision, one that opened a door and raised a mirror. And what that mirror shows next is where we're going now. You don't expect redemption to look like city gutters, but in Burkina Faso, that's exactly where it began. Weeks after the decree took effect, the first wave of reassigned inmates stepped into streets long neglected by municipal budgets. Gutters choked by decades of runoff and waste were cleared in days. Illegal dump sites vanished. Parks began to reappear beneath layers of overgrowth and time. This wasn't symbolic labor. It was real work, solving real problems, at scale, under government supervision, and fully documented. The numbers are striking. Within just 1 month, over 400 metric tons of waste were removed. Public roads were resurfaced, footpaths restored. Entire blocks of urban space, previously written off, were reclaimed. But behind the stats are the people doing the work. People who, just weeks earlier, were seen as disposable. One inmate, 24 years old, said in an interview, "When I was sentenced, they called me a threat. Now, the same people wave at me while I sweep their street." That's the kind of moment you don't design in policy. You only get it when people are allowed to be visible again. And that's part of the hidden logic behind Traoré's plan. Justice isn't just about who's punished. It's about who gets to be seen, who gets to belong again. In most systems, including ours here in the US, incarceration tends to make people disappear. Out of sight, out of mind. But what if that invisibility is part of the problem? We think the public's perception of crime is shaped less by data and more by distance. The farther we push people away, the easier they are to write off. But once you see someone planting a tree beside your kid's school, once you see them fixing the same road your bus drives over each morning, they're no longer an abstraction. They're a neighbor in motion. Of course, that proximity can be uncomfortable, especially for victims, especially for families who carry the weight of what was done. There's no pretending that all offenses are equal or that every person should be released. This program doesn't pretend that either, but it does suggest something radical, that some forms of restoration can happen not behind closed doors, but out in the open. The justice system has always operated in the shadows. What Burkina Faso is doing, whether you agree with it or not, is turning the lights on. And with that light, something else becomes visible. The sheer amount of national development that was never getting done. Blocked canals, broken benches, abandoned land. How many projects do we delay because we assume the labor doesn't exist? And what if it does, just wearing the wrong uniform? No one's claiming this is perfect, but maybe perfection was never the goal. Maybe the real victory is that people once discarded are now part of the equation again. And when you change the inputs, you can't help but change the outcome. What happens next depends on how much we're willing to reimagine the roles we give people. Not when they're at their best, but when they're at their lowest. Because if redemption can begin in a ditch, it probably says more about the system than the shovel. And in this case, it's not just the ground that's being cleared. It's the air around how we define justice itself. The real reform didn't begin in the streets. It started with a question. Weeks before the decree was signed, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat down for a national TV interview, and in the middle of a calm, formal conversation, he leaned forward and asked, "Did we have prisons in Africa before the colonizers came?" The room went silent. The host didn't answer, so Traoré did. "No, we had restorative systems, we had councils, we had reintegration, we didn't build cages for poverty." That sentence did something legislation rarely does. It shifted the emotional axis of the entire debate. Because once you ask where a system came from, you can't help but ask who it was designed to serve. We think it's a question worth asking not just in Burkina Faso, but here too. Who built the models we still use, and why are we still borrowing them when the results keep failing? Across Africa, the majority of prison infrastructure still follows colonial blueprints. Cells built for control, not restoration. Codes written in European capitals, enforced in African towns. A system never designed to heal the continent, only to suppress it. What Traoré did wasn't just legal, it was historical. He didn't tweak the prison system, he rejected the logic behind it. And that logic, to be clear, wasn't African. It was imported. It came with empire, not ethics. In the US, we recognize some of that same DNA in our own system. Sentencing disparities, overcrowded jails, privatized punishment, systems that punish without preparing, that isolate without healing, that lock people away only to release them emptier than before. And that's the thing Traoré called out most clearly. He called it manufactured criminality, a system that creates repeat offenders by design, not accident. Because when you give someone no job, no training, no dignity, what exactly do we expect them to become? Let's be honest, we can't expect transformation from people we've done nothing to transform. The policy shift in Burkina Faso is built on a gamble that even after conviction, people still have value. Not theoretical, emotional value, functional, measurable, national value. And if that idea unsettles you, maybe that's the point. Because when a prisoner builds a bench for a school, or plants a tree in a public park, or learns carpentry behind bars, we're no longer dealing in abstract hope. We're dealing in outcome. There will be people who see this as soft, as naive, as politically risky. But the bigger risk might be staying stuck in systems that aren't working and calling that safety. There's a generation coming up that's watching what happens in places like Burkina Faso. They're not waiting on foreign approval. They're not asking for imported models. They're building their own definitions of justice. And if this kind of rethinking matters to you, if you're tired of the same broken cycle being sold as progress, then share this story. Don't just scroll. Engage. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of reporting, more questions, fewer slogans. Because whether or not we agree with every move, what's happening in Burkina Faso deserves attention. Not because it's perfect, but because it's brave. And in the end, the systems we inherit aren't the ones we have to live with. They're just the ones we've been too afraid to question. That fear? It's starting to crack. And when it does, what fills the space isn't chaos, it's design. Sometimes the real revolution doesn't start outside. It starts behind locked doors. While the public watched inmates clean streets and plant trees, something quieter but no less important was happening inside Burkina Faso's prisons. Workshops were opening. Tools were being handed out, not to fix broken pipes, but to rebuild broken futures. In select correctional facilities, the government introduced economic production units. Inmates were trained in tailoring, carpentry, and agriculture. Uniforms were stitched for local schools, desks and chairs built for public offices. Small-scale crops were grown, some for prison use, some sold in nearby markets. And in an unusual move, some prisoners were allowed to keep a portion of the profits. Not a full wage, but enough to send home or to save for the day the gates opened for real. One woman, serving time for unpaid debts, now sews uniforms in a sunlit room alongside 5 others. For the first time in years, she said, "My hands are doing something my children can be proud of." That's not just reform, that's recovery, measured in dignity. We think that's the piece often missing in conversations about justice, especially in the West. We talk about rehabilitation, but rarely fund it. We want lower recidivism, but give people nothing to return to. We say, do your time, but forget to ask, what happens after? This approach flips that logic. Instead of focusing solely on the crime, it invests in the person who committed it. Instead of waiting for time to pass, it uses that time to produce value for the individual, for the system, for the country. That doesn't mean ignoring harm. It means asking whether punishment alone makes anything better. And if we believe people can grow, even behind walls, what would it look like to water that growth, not just contain it? The cost is real. Training takes time, tools break, mistakes happen. But what's the cost of doing nothing? Of sending people back into society with no skill, no income, no sense of purpose? We've seen that model here and elsewhere. It doesn't end well. What's happening in Burkina Faso doesn't look flashy. There are no headlines for a well-made school desk. But when that desk is made by someone once labeled a criminal and it's used by a child learning to read, that's not just production. That's redemption in motion. This isn't a shortcut. It's the long, hard road of responsibility, taken not just by the inmates, but by the system itself. And once you see that path being built, you can't help but wonder, how much potential have we already buried behind bars? That question doesn't end here. Because for every change happening inside the prison walls, something else is shifting outside of them. At first, people watched from a distance. By week 3, they were bringing water. The rollout of Burkina Faso's prison labor reform was met with silence, curiosity, suspicion. Cameras stayed back, eyebrows stayed raised, and then something shifted. In a market district of Ouagadougou, inmates were clearing decades-old drainage systems. On day 1, no one said a word. By day 3, Aicha, a food vendor nearby, brought them bread and clean water. I used to be afraid of prisoners, she told a local reporter, but they're fixing what city workers never touched. How can I not help? That's not just a reaction, it's a reset. It's what happens when visibility returns, when people who were meant to be forgotten are suddenly in your neighborhood. Not as threats, but as laborers with gloves and shovels. We think Americans might relate more than we care to admit, because we know what it's like to live near systems we don't understand, to carry assumptions, to fear the unknown, and then to have those assumptions interrupted by something real, a person working hard, trying to contribute right in front of you. Across Burkina Faso, stories like Aicha's started multiplying. In Bobo Dioulasso, children waved at inmates driving trucks. In a small town near Koudagou, a farmer passed by a cleared field and realized it had been full of trash the month before. I thought it was the government, he said. It was the guys who used to sit behind the fence. And in one mother's voice message, posted online and shared thousands of times, my son was jailed for stealing rice. Now he's planting mango trees in our town. He's building a future he thought he'd never touch. That's the kind of redemption a courtroom can't script, because it's not just about the individual, it's about the space they're re-entering. For the public, this wasn't about perfection. It was about effort, presence, sweat, the visible return of the unseen. But with it came an unexpected effect, a quiet dismantling of the wall between us and them. And this is where things get complicated, because some aren't ready for that wall to come down. Justice systems all over the world, including ours, are built on that division. Prisoners are tucked away, labeled, archived. We rarely ask what happens when they come back, only how long until they do. But what if they never really left? What if the re-entry isn't about finishing a sentence, but about being allowed to be seen again? This model doesn't guarantee forgiveness. It doesn't erase harm. But it gives people a space to show up and let society decide how to respond. That comes with risks. Not everyone will be ready to see inmates in public spaces. Some communities will resist. Some already are. But that discomfort may be part of the process, because when justice moves from isolation to integration, it doesn't just change the prisoner, it changes the community. And in Burkina Faso, that shift is already underway. But for the government, the next challenge wasn't emotional, it was logistical. Because transforming justice wasn't only about symbolism, it was about cost.
What if justice didn't just change lives, but also saved money? For years, governments across Africa and around the world have been told a familiar story, that large-scale public service requires large-scale outside help, that without grants, consultants, or donor-funded contractors, infrastructure can't move. Burkina Faso just proved otherwise. By mobilizing its prison population into a structured public labor force, the country avoided outsourcing over $5 million in sanitation and city maintenance contracts. Instead, it redirected those funds into local materials, supervision, training, and tools, resources that stayed inside national borders. Not a single dollar came from the IMF. Not one development loan was signed, and still, the gutters were cleaned, the fields cleared, the trees planted. That's more than clever budgeting. That's political philosophy in action. Traoré's government framed it clearly. We're not cutting corners, we're cutting dependence. We think that message hits different when you come from a country like ours, where debates over spending can feel abstract, until you realize entire budgets are built on whether we believe people can change. In this case, the people doing the work weren't just cheap labor. They were the labor that already existed and had been ignored. That shift from expense to asset is what economists are now watching closely. Could this model be replicated in rural clinics, in agriculture, in education? Officials in Burkina Faso are already saying yes. The Ministries of Health and Agriculture have requested extensions of the program into government farms and rural maintenance teams. This isn't about replacing workers, it's about revealing ones we didn't count, because if we think justice is expensive, Maybe we haven't calculated what stagnation really costs. One inmate assigned to a reforestation site outside Gaoua put it plainly. "I never thought I'd be useful again. Now I'm planting something that'll outlive me." It's hard to put a dollar amount on that kind of return, but we'd argue it's the kind of investment that pays in more than just budget lines. Of course, there are trade-offs. Relying on inmate labor raises ethical questions. Where's the line between service and exploitation? What guarantees fairness, dignity, and voluntary participation? These are valid concerns, and they're not going away. But if the alternative is bloated contracts, missing funds, and endless dependence on external aid, what are we really protecting? Sometimes the most radical shift isn't in who does the work, it's in who controls the terms of progress. That shift, from foreign-funded to internally driven, says something deeper about sovereignty. And if this kind of rethink on justice and governance is something you believe matters, drop a comment, share your view. Hit follow so you stay in the loop when policy stops being paperwork and starts becoming motion. Because when nations learn to build with what they already have, the world has to start recalculating what underdeveloped even means. But the story doesn't end with budgets and work boots. Because when you change how a country sees its prisoners, you start changing how it sees its people. You know a system is changing when even the kids start asking different questions. In communities across Burkina Faso, the most unexpected transformation hasn't been in the streets or the budgets. It's been in the way people look at those once called criminals. For decades, prisons in West Africa, like in much of the world, have been built to contain. Out of sight, out of trust. Even after release, many former inmates carried the same sentence, just without the bars. Now, that wall is starting to crack. Parents who once walked their children past prison walls in silence now point to benches built by inmates. In one village near Koudougou, a teacher said her students asked, "Can they come plant trees at our school too?" That kind of shift doesn't come from policy. It comes from presence. When people see someone contributing, not despite their past, but because they've been given a path forward, perception starts to loosen. Not erase, but evolve. We think that's the quiet power in this model. Not just the work being done, but the narrative being rewritten. And let's be honest, we don't just see this dynamic in Africa. In America, too, we draw sharp lines between innocence and guilt. We're quick to decide who deserves a second chance and who should disappear. But what if people are more complicated than that binary allows? What if justice wasn't about removal, but repair? Of course, this comes with emotional weight. There are real victims. There is real harm. Forgiveness, reintegration. These things are messy. They take time. But when a nation begins to involve its most marginalized in the work of nation building, something else happens. Ownership starts to replace exile. People begin to say, "our country," with a little more weight. Because when you're handed a shovel instead of a sentence and you use it to fix the street your own mother walks on, you're not just serving time, you're reshaping where you belong. Some argue this kind of reform is too idealistic, too soft, too symbolic. But maybe that's because we've grown used to a justice system that humiliates before it heals. Maybe the real risk isn't trying something new. Maybe it's settling for what never really worked. And when communities begin to trust again, when the formerly feared are seen building something better, it's not just the justice system that shifts. It's the definition of who we are and who we allow each other to become. That change can't be forced. It has to be felt. And in Burkina Faso, for the first time in a long time, people are starting to feel it. Not just in policies or programs, but in neighborhoods, in eye contact, in footsteps that no longer avoid the men in uniforms. But the world isn't standing by quietly. Because when one country rewrites the rules of justice without asking permission, others start paying attention. Change is quiet until it isn't. At first, the international response to Burkina Faso's prison reform was muted, curious, confused, maybe even condescending. But silence doesn't last long when a global South country begins rewriting rules without Western consultants in the room. Within weeks, media outlets in Europe and the US picked up the story. Some praised the policy as innovative. Others called it optics. One American headline asked bluntly, "Rehabilitation or forced labor?" That question revealed more than just skepticism. It revealed discomfort. Because what happens when a low-income nation, often described as unstable, launches a justice reform that works better without foreign aid? That's not just a story. That's a challenge to the entire framework. In Washington and Brussels, the concern wasn't legal. Burkina Faso wasn't violating human rights. Prisoners participated voluntarily, were compensated, and received training. No IMF loans, no external oversight, and still, results. The real threat was precedent. If this works there, why hasn't it worked here? We think that's a fair question. What have decades of donor-funded justice reforms actually delivered, aside from prettier reports and longer sentences? Why do the systems we export still struggle to produce dignity? Why does a military captain in West Africa seem to be building more social trust with shovels than we've managed with entire policy teams? Across the Black diaspora, from Atlanta to London to Lagos, conversations started to shift. Some asked, "Why aren't our prisons doing this?" Others said, "Maybe we stopped believing we could build systems for ourselves." The ripple effect was real. Leaders in Guinea, Mali, and southern Nigeria initiated exploratory discussions. Pan-African journals debated whether this reform was a blueprint or a one-off. And back in Burkina Faso, something deeper was taking root. Not every reaction was applause. There were doubts, concerns about optics, scalability, control. But there's one thing critics couldn't deny. The country moved, on its own terms. And in doing so, it forced everyone else to move too. Because when a nation redefines justice without asking permission, it doesn't just rewrite law. It redraws the line between dependency and direction, and maybe that's the part we weren't ready for. Not that Burkina Faso released inmates, but that it no longer asked the West what freedom is supposed to look like. That's not just policy, that's power. And power, once used differently, becomes contagious. What we just covered isn't a perfect system. It's not a fix-all. And it's definitely not a recommendation manual. This content is meant to inform, to question, and sometimes to challenge what we think we know about justice. From my point of view, what's happening in Burkina Faso isn't about who's right. It's about who's willing to try something different, without waiting for global permission slips. I think there's something powerful in that. Not because it guarantees results, but because it reclaims the right to experiment with sovereignty. To ask, what if we handled our broken systems like we handle broken roads, by putting people to work rebuilding them? You don't have to agree with everything. I don't even know if I do, but I guess that's the point. Conversation, not conversion. And if this kind of story makes you think deeper, even just for a second, hit that subscribe. We've got more stories like this coming. new updates, new angles, new voices. Catch you in the next one. It's something you'll want to see.